So this video is about taking the wheel weights off this 1940 John Deere H. And as you can see, the wheel weights are on the inside of the wheels, and they're the most massive wheel weights I've ever seen. I think they weigh about 350 pounds a piece. And they make taking them off really kind of treacherous because of the weight of them. So I've set out in this project to remove those wheel weights. I have someone who's interested in taking them off my hands. And I just like to get them off so that I don't have to mess with them anymore. If I have wheel weights on this tractor, I like to put them on the outside of the rear wheels, not on the inside. This video, the sound was all messed up, and so I'm voice over recording the information here. The reason these are so difficult to take off is because the hole on the inside of the wheel weights that go over the axle aren't large enough to fit over the hub. So you can't just take the wheel off and then slide the whole apparatus over the hub. So you got to take the hub off as well, which means you got to use a puller to drag the hub 6 or 8 inches off of the spline shaft on each side. So this just complicates the process of removing these wheel weights, because you got to remove the entire wheel, the hub, and the weight all as one unit. And then you can separate them after you have them off. But then, they weigh close to 400 pounds each, so they're a lot for even a crane and one person to manage once you get them off. So that's what we're going to do in this video, is to take those off. So I'll be adding some comments as we go. So thanks for watching. This next little part just looks at the collar itself and how that thing works. It's designed, it has 3 bolts that bolt into the hub. And again, that squeezes the spline shaft on the kind of the part of the hub that sticks out and compresses itself when it's tightened up. So you loosen those 3 bolts, but the thing's been on there for however long, so it's not going to just fall off. But the hub is designed to take 2 of those bolts and put them back in these other 2 holes that then press the collar off of the hub. And the problem with that is that the bolts that I had only had threads for about 1 inch. And you really got to have more threads than that to reach the part of the hub where these bolts push the collar off. I went to Ace Hardware hoping to find bolts that size with threads all the way to the bolt head, but they didn't have any. So I came back empty-handed, and I think the solution was to put a crowbar, the tip of a crowbar, in behind each bolt, and then tighten the bolts against that crowbar. And the crowbar acted as a spacer between the hub and the bolt, and that seemed to work just fine. The collar, you need to press it off just maybe a 1/2 inch, and then it kind of falls off after that. So once you get the collar off, then you can just set those 3 bolts aside. Although I'm going to use them in the next little part for a surface to hook onto with the puller. I'll show you that in a minute. All right, this next part has, you've got the collar off. And so now the objective is to use a puller or some device to take the wheel and the hub and the wheel weights that are all connected off the spline shaft without killing everybody and without having it knock the tractor off its jack stands or the jack, because it's really heavy. And so I've got the crane hooked up. It goes through the strap, a 3,000-pound strap that goes through the center of the wheel weight up through the wheel and then around the tire with a hook on either side, hooked to the hook on the engine hoist. And I'm keeping that taut so that the axle isn't supporting all the weight as we move this thing off the axle. Because when it finally lets go, I don't want it to drop. I don't want it to flop around. I want it to kind of just stay where it is so that I can try to pull the jack away from the spline shaft in the tractor. So the 3 bolts I mentioned that hold the collar on, I put those back in the hub most of the way in. And then I set up a wheel puller, my largest one, I believe, so that I could hook onto those 3 bolt heads to start using the ratchet then to turn the puller to slowly extract this whole massive set of parts off the spline shaft. And it worked really well. It's kind of a slow go. And there didn't seem to be any rough spots where I just couldn't get it to budge or anything. I didn't have to pound on anything, which was a shocker. It was nice to see a wheel puller actually pull a wheel off of a shaft. And rarely have I had good luck with kind of these lower end wheel pullers. This set of them came from Harbor Freight, and I've never really successfully used them because the hooks just don't seem to really grab on very well. But with the bolt heads, these worked real well, and I was surprised. The hardest part is keeping all the hooks on the 3 bolt heads, because as you're turning this thing, sometimes it takes 2 hands, and I'm using one of my torque wrenches, which has a real long handle, to just lessen the pressure that I need to put on it. But it all worked out pretty well. And you have to slide this whole apparatus 6 or 8 inches along this spline shaft for it to come off the end. And so as I went along that process, I was always checking my engine hoist to see if it's pulled far enough away. I didn't want the wheel tilting at any point. I wanted it straight up and down. And so I wanted to make sure that as I'm moving it out several inches, that I'm moving the jack or the hoist a little bit to kind of match that so that it's tracking where the wheel actually is hanging. So again, that process worked pretty well. And you can see I made a lot of headway in this little section here. And then I'll talk about the next section in a minute. All right, in this little section, you can see I've got about 2 or 3 inches left on the wheel puller before it runs its course. And I found that I had to adjust the wheel pullers, use different hook sizes and different things in order to get enough length to get the shaft all the way, to get the hub all the way off the shaft. So when you reach the end of a wheel puller's capacity, you have to pause and kind of reassess and shorten everything up, maybe tighten those bolts up some to make them a little shorter to fit whatever hooks you're using on the wheel puller. So this was kind of a challenge to get enough capacity in the puller as you start another round of pulling to try to get it all the way, because you do have to, the hub itself is probably 5 inches deep. And so it requires you to go 5 inches off the end of the shaft, which means you got to use the longest threaded puller part that you have in most cases. So that was complicated a little bit, just added a little bit to this process. But you can see in this part, we're going to hit the end of this puller. And so you have to take the puller off and reassess where we are before I go find another puller or adjust the puller I was using. I used two different pullers, one the largest one and then one a little bit smaller. Sometimes I even changed out the center shaft, the threaded shaft, between the two pullers in order to minimize the amount of adjusting I had to do on the hooks. But it all worked out, and we finally got through it. But you got to be kind of patient and work through it, and because you got to get at some point you got to get a puller that will reach over the hub, grab the bolt heads, and yet still find the inside of the shaft as you're pulling. So now you can see that I'm using a smaller puller, which just happened to fit everything I needed it to do. Although I'm going to have to change out the puller one more time before I get this thing off the shaft, because the small puller, worked well for the interim section of pulling, but it kind of crapped out before I could get it all the way off the shaft. So I'll have to change again once this thing runs its course. So I think what I'm doing here is I've in the just previous to this, I tightened up the puller as far as it would go, and then I believe what I did is I pulled out the center threaded portion of the puller and put a longer one in, and just maintained and used the same puller. I just put a longer bolt down the middle of it, so that I could go a little bit further and get to the end of uh, the pulling the wheel off the spindle. So that's what's going on here, and I'm continuing to pull the wheel off the spindle the last inch or two. And then in this section, I take a lot of effort to make sure the wheel is hanging straight and that there's no chance of it falling back towards the tractor once it comes off the spindle, because I don't want the weight and the um, momentum of the wheel and the wheel weight and the hub weight, all of that hitting the tractor spindle in an awkward way and knocking the tractor off of its stand or the jack. So checking it every couple of turns of the puller to make sure that I'm on top of, making sure that the weight is on the crane and that the wheel's not going to fall down once it comes off the spindle. I want it to stay right where it is so that I can pull it away from the spindle without knocking the tractor. So, me, I'm always afraid of the horrid thing that might happen. So I'm trying to be real careful. So I may be adjusting that and taking a look at it every so many turns. All right, well, we're finally at the end of the pulling operation on this first wheel. And I've sped this up a little bit because I'm sure it's getting kind of tedious. But you can see in this section where the wheel finally separates from the axle, the spindle, and comes loose. And again, the concern that you can see the bottom of the wheel is moving out faster than the top, and that's one of the things I was trying to prevent. So, um, once I get off the axle, then the operation is to move the wheel as soon as possible and as smoothly as possible away from the tractor so that it doesn't bump anything. Once you get it off the spindle and away from the tractor, you can deal with it. It's not easy to deal with given the size of the crane that I have, but I'll show you that in a minute. So the next step here is to, now that I've moved the crane and the wheel and the weights away from the tractor, the next step is to lower the crane and to set um, the whole deal on some blocks so that I can get up under it and take the bolts off and then lift the tire off the weights. That's the next part of the operation. And what I found is that the crane legs set up a certain height off the pavement, and it exceeds two 4x4s. I have a lot of 4x4 pieces that I use to block things up on, and you got to go a couple of 4x4s plus a 2x4 in order to get above the leg so that you don't have the weight of the wheel with the weights um, keeping your crane from being able to move around, because you need to take the crane out from under it at some point. And just laying it down is awkward with the crane because the legs go out at angles and the tire is, pretty big and awkward. So it was difficult. Once I had the wheel weight and the wheel still attached to each other on blocks, I was able to reach underneath and hold the nut on the bottom and use a ratchet on the top to take the 4 bolts out that held these two things together. And that worked out really well. Those came off real easy. They're relatively new bolts, seems like, so that they weren't all corroded and rusty, and they turned pretty easy. So I really didn't have to hold them much. So that worked out well. You can see the wheel weight by itself there, and the wheel leaning up against the shop. So now that the wheel's leaning up against the shop, I turn it around, and I decided, in order to put the wheel back on, rather than try to line up the hub to the axle and then potentially have to pound it in to get it about 5 1/8 inches in from the end of the spindle, I decided to take the hub off, or take the wheel off the hub, put the hub on, secure it in place, and then install the wheel using the lug nuts. And that seemed to work pretty well. It was a lot easier, I think, to do it that way. And I was going to try the other way on the other side, but I decided it worked so well that I would just do it again. So that's how I put the whole thing back together. And, that's the way I would have liked to have taken this apart in the first place. It would have been so much easier and taken a lot less time. So you can see what the tractor looks like, at least on the left-hand side as you're sitting on the tractor, what the wheel looks like without the wheel weight on it. And it looks like a John Deere H ought to look. It's kind of a thin tire and wheel without all that bulk and weight on it. So this whole project went real well. Of course, I had to do the other side, and I think um, the other side was a little harder only because I think the spindle was kind of scarred up and maybe a little bit corroded, and so it didn't pull off quite as easy. It didn't get stuck or anything. It came off, but I had to adjust the puller many times to keep it on there and to keep it moving off the spindle. And then putting the hub back on, I actually had to tap it on with, I used a block of wood and a 1 pound, a 2 pound sledgehammer to move it on. And it actually moved on pretty well. And it just took some extra time to get it. The first side, I was able to push it on with my hands. And so that worked really well. I also noticed on the right side, the second one that I did, that the hub had a slight little crack in one of the flanges, and didn't seem to be all the way through, and it didn't seem to move at all as I tightened the thing up. So it seemed to work just fine. And I made sure to get both the hubs on the same distance from the end of the spindle so that they're placed symmetrically on both sides. And it's just nice to have the tractor back together without the wheel weights on it. Now I just need to get somebody to come and get those off my hands, and I think I have somebody lined up to do that. So it's been a great project. It's taken a lot longer than I thought it would, and I picked probably the two hottest days of the year to work it through. But it worked out fine. Be glad to be rid of those and to move on to some other projects.